When people begin to game that measure, it's not really useful anymore at that point because it's not measuring what it was intended to do so. As you mentioned on Airbnb, if it's at 4.7, 4.8, like, does that mean that they're going to be responsive, that they're going to be clean, they're going to check out early, so on and so on? It's not clear what that becomes because people begin to game it and it becomes a target rather than really conveying the information that you're seeking.
Today's guest is Hatim Rahman, an award-winning assistant professor of management and organization at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He recently published Inside the Invisible Cage: How Algorithms Control Workers, a book exploring how organizations use algorithms to control workers in a world increasingly run by algorithms and artificial intelligence. Thank you, Hatim, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So your book, The Invisible Cage, talks about how companies use algorithms on digital labor platforms to control workers by setting hidden rules and changing them without any policy, any notice, any explanation, or if they do have a policy, of course, it's hidden.
Yeah.
Right. So can you explain what the invisible cage, in air quotes, is, and then share a few examples of how this invisible cage works?
Yeah, no, thank you for that introduction. And so, yeah, with this metaphor that is in the title in the book called The Invisible Cage, the thesis or the reason that I'm using this metaphor is that for not just on digital platforms, but as organizations are using AI for hiring and AI for evaluation, the thing is the algorithms that are being used in these systems is opaque, or it's hidden in terms of how it operates for people who are being evaluated or for people on these digital platforms. So I'm thinking about like Fiverr, Upwork, Topcoder. But as I mentioned, almost now all organizations, or many of the organizations, one statistic said, I think over 99% of the Fortune 500 companies are using some sort of automated hiring system. And if the rules in the way they operate are hidden and changing, that gets at the invisible part, right? That, we're being evaluated by criteria we cannot see. And the cage part of it is that they increasingly control our opportunities without our say. So that kind of hopefully breaks down the invisible cage aspect of it, that we're essentially a lot of opportunities are being controlled, but not in ways that we can see. So let me give you a couple of examples. One, it wasn't too many years ago that Amazon, for example, reporters described that they were using a AI hiring tool that they found was systematically biased against women. And the way this happened was that it wasn't looking at the name, because that's an easy thing to correct for. Like, don't look at the gender of the name. But what it was doing is that by learning on past data that indicated who Amazon had hired in the past, it tended to be that it was predominantly men. And so what the algorithm was doing was, when it was trying to determine now going forward what makes a successful candidate that they should interview, it was picking up on criteria that looking at extracurricular activities or even the university they attended. So people who attended all women universities, the algorithm was systematically and automatically ranking them as lower fit for the jobs because of their past data, right? And so think about now you as an applicant, you're fully qualified. The university that you went to is important, but not if you have the skills and expertise to do the job, you should be able to at least get an interview or show up somewhat higher on the list. But think about how many millions potentially of women or other applicants were systematically, again, taken out of the hiring pool for those positions. And we know that has implications for people's jobs and their ability in immigration, so on and so forth. So that's a broader example. From my book specifically, so yeah, I'm looking at a higher skilled online labor market. So think about, since this is more accessible, like in Amazon for labor. So the ability to search and hire some of the best people in the world. So software engineers, professors, lawyers, accountants, designers, anything you can think of. They built this platform in that the platform I anonymized for the purposes of the book, called Talent Finder, where you can go and search for somebody to do any task, any project, any duration really, because it brought people from all around the world to sign up. And the way the Invisible Cage worked in this setting was that in the book, I talked about how on these platforms, all digital platforms, they have a rating system, right? So we've used this again on Netflix, on Amazon, where how highly rated is the platform or the thing that you're trying to buy or purchase or hire, person you're trying to hire. And so what all these platforms, including YouTube and others, and the one that I studied, they used a 5-star hiring rating system to evaluate people. And the way it started was that it was very easy to see the criteria, like how well do you communicate, how timely is your responsiveness. But with these rating systems, and this has been true again on all of these platforms, including the ones I mentioned, and another one, Airbnb, for example, almost on all these platforms, when you make the rating criteria easy and transparent, people can game it, right? So that it's easy to figure out how to get a 5-star rating, even when you might not deserve it, or even if you deserve it. And so what happened on the platform I studied, and as I said, it's been happening on pretty much every digital platform, is that when people learn how to game the rating system, everyone then has a high rating. So again, going back to maybe examples that are more accessible, if you're trying to buy a product on Amazon and all of them have a 5-star rating, it's not very useful anymore to make a decision, right? And so what the platform I studied did was, without this notice or explanation, to the workers, they shifted to an opaque rating system where now their criteria by which it's giving them the score and ranking is no longer apparent. So it wasn't necessarily the timeliness or communication or even the 5-star rating system that people were filling out. So I don't know, that was a little of a long answer, but hopefully it's important to kind of establish what I mean by this invisible case. That was very apparent on the platform that I studied, but hopefully the examples I gave kind of show how it's widespread.
You also talked in the book about the iron cage, which I guess be more for employees in a physical location. I believe Max Weber coined this term, talking about bureaucracy and things like that. And basically in your book, you say that many companies that are celebrated for providing employee benefits as modern examples of quote unquote tightening the iron cage, or even more subtly embedding workers' compliance within an organization's culture, the free meals, massages, and nap rooms that organizations like Google, Facebook, and Airbnb provide for workers also encourage them to remain at work for longer hours. You say, why go home when you can eat dinner while you, in air quotes, voluntarily continue working on a project and continue conversations with colleagues? And then basically you say that the iron cage metaphor has proved to be an enduring metaphor to understand how organizations elicit compliance from workers without resorting to managers having to overtly direct and monitor them. So, I mean, what's better, the invisible cage that you're talking about, or the iron cage? Getting massages and nap time and smoothie bars doesn't seem too bad.
That's a great question. And, I like to think about them. There's pros and cons. Now, but to answer your question directly, I would say the iron cage is better because that's a very important portion of the book that you explained very well. The reason that why it's I guess, again, I'm using air quotes here, is better, is because we've had now decades of laws and institutions that have been built around to help people if they encounter problems in the iron cage or if they are discriminated against. It's not easy. It's still hard, but there are laws, institutions in place where, again, if you feel like you've been discriminated, there's fairness in employment and hiring decision, right? That you can kind of avail yourself with. That you can, if you're willing to, and you have the pathways are there for you if you find that there are problems that are there. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight too that I feel is very different that we're getting at, that's because of the laws that were there, is like, I think many of us have been there where we have had negative experiences in an organization, And then we decide to move to a different organization, right? In the iron cage with the iron bar, that image of the iron bar being somewhat, what stays in the cage, what happens in the cage stays in the cage, so to speak, right? Where if you have a bad experience with a boss or employer and you switch to an organization, generally speaking, what happens in that organization doesn't follow you. In fact, there are laws in place where the performance evaluations that you receive in a Google or any other organization, they cannot be publicly shared. In fact, other people in your organization typically cannot see them either. So one big difference that I'm mentioning with the invisible cage, in broadly speaking, as we go to AI and algorithms, is that this information is much more easily shared. And so what happens, I guess, in the invisible cage, if you get a low rating or a low score that you don't know why it happens, all of a sudden that rating and score is propagated across the digital ecosystem, where somebody's searching your name on Google or on LinkedIn or I guess Bing or maybe ChatGPT or other things like that. If it pulls that information from the online space, now all of a sudden it can be shared with people you don't necessarily want it to be shared with.
When I was reading your book, what I gathered was basically office politics are replaced by AI or an algo. I don't know what's better, I guess, but office politics also are not, transparent. They constantly change, who you report to or the power dynamics. You have soft power and hard power, and you might not even know the difference between, who's really in charge. So I guess to me, it seemed like at least when you're, stuck at home, at least you're at home and not commuting to work. What do you think, though? I mean, what's the difference between the office politics and the algorithm, or is that a bad analogy that I just made?
No, that's actually, and there is some overlap. Like to your point, I think what you're getting at is that we have always faced these opaque systems, right? Where you don't necessarily know what's happening or why it's occurring. So you're right. I think there's overlap in that it's not something that's completely new. I would say one of the biggest differences is that kind of the speed and scale at which it happens. And then I think the degree of opacity can be higher because it's harder to learn about how the algorithm operates and how it's changing. So what I mean by this is that, again, this is not universal, but for a lot of office politics in dynamics, when you're new, I guess it would be very similar to the invisible cage, right? Like you don't know it, it's hard to know. But generally over time, you get socialized. You begin to learn what is a soft and hard power, right? So the people who are like kind of grizzled veterans, right? Who have been there for many years, if you become friends with them, or something like that, you would know. They would eventually tell you or let you in for how it works and what's happening. But again, to answer your question directly, I think the speed and scale of algorithms is what's different. So in an office culture, you will definitely have elements that are very similar to the invisible cage, but I think the speed and scale at which it changes is slightly different, or I would say it's very different. And then, as I mentioned, if you're willing, and if things aren't going well and you're being systematically facing bias or discrimination, there are established laws in place that you could, go take advantage of. Whereas right now, in the digital platform space, in with algorithms and AI more broadly, we're still in the early stages of regulation. That it's harder for workers and for others if they wanted to pursue recourse.
In your book, you talk a lot about the rating system, and you mentioned how basically in 1995, eBay was founded and had this 5-star rating. And of course, I mean, what is eBay? eBay is essentially a garage sale on the internet. So we're now comparing people or using the same rating system for used shoes or sneakers or whatever you're selling on eBay to actual human beings. And then you also mention Goodhart's law, which all Goodhart's law is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So when everyone's trying to get a 5-star rating, what does a 5-star rating mean? And I just recently was checking this out. It says that for Airbnb, the average guest rating is between a 4.7 and 4.8.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what does that even mean when every And you talk about rating inflation in your book quite a bit. But I mean, for like Airbnb, which I think a lot of people can relate to, I mean, what the hell does a 4.7, 4.8 mean?
No, you're exactly right. So, it's interesting to think about, right now we're doing ratings for everything, right? Like your doctor, the parking lot, I don't know, right? I mean, you may have experienced this too. Like even now in some airports, there's like bathrooms, like how was your bathroom experience? And one of the points that you mentioned that I think is important that I want to highlight is that people are not products, people are not bathrooms, people are not movies, right? And it's interesting that eBay was really the first platform that scaled the success of the rating system online. And it may work very well for products, or as you mentioned, like a garage sale, right? How good is a product or not? But when you work on a project, especially a complex project with somebody you hire, a contractor that you hire, they're going to be ups and downs. And it's really hard to capture all those ups and downs in a single rating or a single criteria. And so that becomes problematic when we're just kind of copying and pasting something that was designed for, a very simple, comparatively simple market to now a more complex and complicated interaction situation. And then, yeah, the second thing that you mentioned is kind of a broader point that I think many of us have experienced. But yeah, academics are good with coming up with these laws, right? So when you mentioned this Goodhart's law, is that when you measure something, it is useful to a certain extent. But when people, what I meant more simply, when people begin to game that measure, it's not really useful anymore at that point because it's not measuring what it was intended to do so, right? So as you mentioned on your baby, if it's at 4.7, 4.8, like does that mean that they're going to be responsive, that they're going to be clean, they're going to check out early, so on and so it's not clear what that becomes because of this. What I mentioned, Goodhart's law, is that people begin to game it and it becomes a target rather than really conveying the information that you're seeking.
We're only a few years outside of the pandemic, outside of COVID, where a lot of workers went remote. Yeah. And right now you can read conflicting reports. Some people are like, oh, you got to come back to the office. Yeah. It seems like upper management wants people coming back to the office at least a few days a week. The employees seem like they want to stay at home. So how is what you're saying, what's like the most applicable parts to the future of work in terms of these remote workers?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Now, I also want to highlight another thing. Right? So there's some studies that have shown that 40% of workers in the U.S. Have used an online platform to find work. Okay, so even if we take out the traditional employment, many people in the U.S. and really these platforms are digital, right, around the world, are global in nature. So I think it obviously applies very directly to people who are using these digital platforms. Now, to your question about working from home, now you're right that many studies have shown that we have seen more return to office, but it hasn't reached the level that we were in 2019 before the pandemic. So all of us, or especially knowledge workers, many of them, or the vast majority of them, will be doing some form of remote work. And we have seen examples and where a lot of companies try to sell that, kind of use these opaque algorithms to monitor the productivity when workers are working from home. And, so that's where we could see this be problematic. And in the book, I talked about how there's some emerging reports talking about how lawyers, who work remotely, and lawyers often work on like kind of contract or hourly rates, where they're installing this tracking software where, if you're not looking at the camera long enough, it could, log you out and not allow you to track hours. But what some of these lawyers have reported is that even if they're looking, they can get logged off of the platform. So that comes to opacity, and it could be maybe bad lighting, it could be a glitch in the software. They don't necessarily know. They're not necessarily told. And so if companies, and again, there are reports that they begin to use these remote, what they call productivity monitoring softwares and tools. And, I'll also say that Microsoft recently said that their Copilot or their AI that they're rolling out it has a capability, built-in capability to take routine screenshots of what you're working on and what you're doing on your laptop, right? And that should raise red flags for everyone because it can exactly feed into the dynamics that we're talking about. That all of a sudden you have all them routinely taking in these opaque algorithms trying to assess your productivity, and all of a sudden you come up to your performance evaluation and like, oh, compared to someone else who was, I don't know, who's able to figure out how to game the system, your productivity is lower, and therefore, they may not, usually they won't tell you why, your raise isn't as high, or when these layoffs are being made. By the way, there were reports that when some of these tech companies were making layoff decisions, that they were using some of these productivity monitoring softwares. For example, how many lines of code did you write? Which has nothing to do with the quality of a programmer worker you are, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that, again, we are in an emerging state, which is maybe akin to what we experienced 100 years ago when bureaucracies were coming online. I can talk about that more later if you want to hear about the historical connection. But in the early days, it's hard, especially US workers, because we don't have a lot of systematic policies in place right now. There isn't a lot of protection. And let me just give one more anecdote. So, I teach students about some of these systems, and I brought up a company that was a global company, and they were using this kind of remote or this productivity tracking type of software that was very opaque. And there's a student in my class, when they're reading this case, they raise their hand and they're like, wait, this is my company. And I had no idea that they were using this opaque productivity monitoring software. And they're like, I need to figure out, like, is it enabled on my computer? How are they using it, right? So the point is, even if it's maybe not widespread, the potential for it to happen is very high right now.
One of the major themes of your book was the gig economy, the sharing economy, whatever you want to call it, because you talk a lot about freelancers, independent contractors, things like that are working remote. In your book, The Invisible Cage, you say, quote, starting in the 1980s, shareholders began seeing employees as costs rather than assets. Companies that cut labor costs were rewarded by the stock market, leading many to outsource complex projects to low-wage countries. And by hiring workers as independent contractors, in air quotes for the listening audience, companies avoided paying benefits like healthcare and retirement. And then, of course, they could terminate contracts without any severance pay. That was kind of, paraphrasing what you said. And I think what you just mentioned about this, you probably are talking, prior about the robber baron era, a little over 100 years ago, and the start of the corporation, which led to massive bureaucracy. And then, of course, the government got massive bureaucracy in the 1930s, trying to bust up the bureaucracy of the corporation. Yeah. So can you kind of tie that into what you wanted to talk about and then what I was discussing as well?
Sure, yeah. So I think there are a couple of things to unpack in what you said, right? What I'm worried about with these kind of opaque AI algorithm systems is about accountability and transparency, right? As you mentioned, there are problems with bureaucracies becoming very large in terms of like inefficiency and how they operate. However, going back to the robber baron era and others, and maybe even further, like when factories first came about, there wasn't a lot of accountability or transparency. So one of the examples that I've been citing earlier, right, is that at one point factory work was so easy to do that children could do it, right? And at that time, there were no laws and regulations preventing children from working in these factories. And I think, well, we all agree now, like that wasn't good, right? Like it was important to develop some sort of accountability and transparency to protect children from being in these dangerous factories or performing these jobs and works, right? And so that's what I meant by like, I think we're in a similar stage where organizations are kind of using these new technologies and systems without where broadly as a society, we haven't figured out what is the optimal level of accountability and transparency, right? Too much, of course, can be hindering for innovation and the way people operate and create these inefficiencies, but too little, especially for workers who are being evaluated and where these systems are are influencing our careers and our lives, too little is problematic, right? I mentioned some examples earlier, but think about credit scores, mortgage applications, increasingly college applications. We talked about hiring system. There's variation in all those that I mentioned, but if opaque algorithms are being used in these situations and circumstances, even I believe have in the footnote, police are increasingly using it to these facial recognition algorithms to determine who to arrest, right? And again, if there's good accountability and transparency, maybe it could work well. Maybe it helps us find the person, but without it, there are reports that the wrong people are being arrested and they don't really know why or how to challenge it. That's kind of the parallel to the past, where in the early days we had similar kind of difficulty in holding people accountable and transparent. And I think we're in a similar stage now as it relates to these new technologies.
I was watching you listening to you, depending on what medium you're using, but you were talking about a study at Harvard. So basically, you were saying that according to a study by Harvard economist James Benson, out of the 270 occupations listed in the 1950 U.S. Census, only one position has been eliminated by automation. And that one position is the elevator operator, which I don't even think across the board has been eliminated, because if you go to some, more affluent places, I mean, how dare someone actually has to press a button by themselves? So even that position is not 100% eliminated. But the bottom line is, everyone's always afraid of like, oh, how is the AI, going to impact me? And you talk about that a little bit in the book and these algorithms, but I never heard that study before. And I found that quite interesting, because everyone's always like, when your kids graduate college, they won't even,
right.
The job market will be 100% different. And then according to this, you're going back to 1950. We're barely out of World War II.
Right. Yeah. Well, so think about that. As you said, what has happened since 1950, right? Internet, smartphone, GPS, high speed. I said high speed internet, but like laptops, computers. So what I'm trying to draw attention to by mentioning that research is that technology almost very rarely eliminates your job, but it does change the nature of the job, right? So this is what I'm trying to get at here, is that instead of being so worried about like, and again, for some industries, we should be thinking about it. And it is important to think about, again, there aren't as many, for example, secretaries as there were in the past. So the types of jobs do change. But to me, the question is, the new jobs that are created, or the ones that become plentiful, what are the quality of those jobs? How much do they pay? Going back to what I just talked about, how much accountability is there? How much transparency is there? How much autonomy do you have? I think those are really important questions that is the underlying theme of the book as well, is that like, yes, again, let me just state it here as well, is that the way that we use these technologies really reflects what organizations and society prioritize, right? So just to be clear, I'm not like, technology can be and often is very wonderful. It's just how do we use it? So when I talked about how it's opaque, it changes very fast, those are somewhat organizational decisions, right? Organizations can make them transparent. Organizations can make them more accountable. They can provide explanation. But because of what I talked about, there are really good counterbalancing factors to ensure we find the optimal level. Right now, it isn't the case.
We talked about rating inflation earlier, but basically, if you make the formula or the algorithm, whatever you want to call it, very transparent, then people just optimize for that, as we talked about, Goodhart's law before. If there's zero transparency, then people are, like you mentioned, they have anxiety. You have a perfect score one day, then the next day they're down to, they go from an A to a C. And then, of course, maybe that's going to kick you off the platform. And I was reading some studies on Airbnb, just because there was more information on Airbnb than on the topics that you were discussing, which is why I wanted to invite you on, because you were talking about things that were not really talked about. But in some of the Airbnb studies, they were saying that the reason for the rating inflation was one, survivorship bias. So the buildings or the units, whatever, that had 3 scores, or 3 stars, were like, I'm not going to make any money. No one's booking me. So they just drop off. And then all the new people that are joining basically have to have lower prices. Same thing for Airbnb, or for what you're talking about with this labor platform. You have to have lower prices and provide a high level of service to ensure that you get your first 5-star rating so you can continue to get more customers.
Yeah. So, this is a really good point that we touched upon a little bit earlier. Is let's think about the type of market or the type of object we're referring to. So, what I mentioned that like what you're looking for and how useful it is. So, one of the distinctions I make is that, let's say on Uber, Lyft, and maybe to some extent Airbnb, like you do want reliable service, right? Like when you rent an Airbnb, you want to make sure there's soap, you want to make sure that you can get in, right? So on and so forth. So you do want some level of conformity or consistency where, what you mentioned, that only the best stay on. That's a good thing to some extent. But in other situations and settings, right? Going back to what I talked about, how you might want to hire a software engineer to help you make a mobile application on Android. If everyone has the same rate, it's hard to ensure you get the right person. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that some situations you want differentiation, right? You want to be able to tell who's the best fit, versus in others, like you actually want everyone to have a very high rating. So I think to your earlier point about like how do you figure out the right level of transparency versus opacity? And it's a hard question. It's not an easy question to answer. But what I'm trying to get at is that I don't think we need to go to extremes, right? We don't need 100% transparency, which we've seen in a lot of these markets, or maybe not 100%, but a very high levels of opacity. So one of the things that I kind of propose in my book is like, what I call this like episodic transparency, or like time to time, or less frequent, but still some level of transparency. So what I talked about earlier is that to prevent gaming, you don't want to necessarily tell them exactly what they're being rated on every single time. But what about once a month, right? Once a month, you tell them, hey, across these 5 projects you worked on, one thing that you can get better on is communicating your expectations, or giving your employer more frequent updates, right? So that allows them to improve over time without having to think about gaming the rating every single time. So yeah, just to summarize, there are 2 points. One is that in some situations, you want uniformity. You want everyone to have the same rating. I think that's more the case on like Uber, Lyft, some product in housing. But in other situations, when you want to know differences, then I think it's important to be able to give people feedback so that they can improve over time.
I found it interesting in your book. You talked about in 2017 that a worker hired a company, or basically a person on TripAdvisor was able to figure out the algorithm, and they opened a fake restaurant in London, one of the largest cities in the world, with over 18,000 restaurants listed and rated on TripAdvisor at the time. And they ranked number 1, kind of proving how easily that system could be manipulated. And then I was thinking back to the early days of Google, where, SEO, or search engine optimization, where you'd have someone searching like, best snowboard, and you would just have a white background, and then you put best snowboard 1 billion times in white so no one could see it, and all of a sudden you rank number 1. We're still 2017, it's not really that long ago. Like, we're still in the early days of these algorithms, right?
Yeah. One takeaway I kind of tell family and friends is like, essentially never trust any ratings online, because it's so easily, as you mentioned, I've talked about this example of book for a little bit more context, that a restaurant previously hired a worker to help them figure out how to make sure their rating systems on Yelp, their restaurant would show up highly when people search for that type of restaurant. And so as that worker began to help this company, they figured out how that algorithm worked. And so just to prove a point of how easy these rating systems can be manipulated, He created a fake restaurant, and as you mentioned, it became the number one trending restaurant on Yelp, or number one rated. And it was actually just its backyard. He was doing it to prove a point. So yeah, I mean, it's in response. Now you can't put white text and become the number one kind of rated search result for that website. So yeah, platforms have increasingly gone to these more opaque systems, and this is what kind of spurred and motivated this book. Of like, okay, like I get it, right? It makes sense why you want more opacity. You don't want to be so easily gamed, but again, just bringing this point that when you err to the extreme end, all of a sudden you get these other weird dynamics happening on these platforms where, as I mentioned, that people become more anxious. You don't necessarily get the best results that are there. There's a whole, kind of subreddit online talking about how these generative AI systems, how easily they can return false information because people are now what they call they're injecting misinformation online that it picks up. And then when you ask about a certain subject, it gives the wrong information, right? So yeah, you're 100% right. The issues that we have experienced in the last 10 years or so, they haven't gone away. They're just coming up in new ways and new forms.
And then on the flip side, if these algorithms were actually like super amazing, I mean, we could possibly be living in like CCP China, where you have the social credit score. You mentioned in the book, you talk a lot about the credit rating for finance. And you mentioned this goes back all the way to the 1800s. And so in your book, towards the end, I believe in chapter 9, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
In chapter 9, you say, just kind of paraphrasing, but you say that companies might stop hiring from job fairs or universities and instead rely solely on algorithms to find workers. These digital platforms would quickly assemble and disband teams, reducing the need for full-time employees. Workers could juggle multiple projects, enhancing their income and resumes with greater potential for upward mobility. However, the responsibility to learn new skills would shift entirely to the workers. Platforms could become monopolies, leaving workers with poor ratings without job opportunities. Ratings might be shared across social media, dating apps, and other platforms, making it difficult for those with bad scores to find work, or maybe even placing a food order on a delivery app because your score is so low.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned earlier about how, in 1950, we've had essentially one automated job replaced. It seems like in this paragraph, you talk about the utopian model as well as the dystopian model kind of at the same time. It seems like neither one of those is really going to happen. And obviously, you don't have a crystal ball. I mean, if you do, you're probably keeping it a secret. But if you did have a crystal ball, what would you project out?
Yeah, that's great. So what chapter 9 and what chapter 9 is really getting at is like, yeah, how do we predict the future? And it's a really hard question. I don't think anyone can really do it. But what I was trying to say is that at the same time, we could try to imagine like what are some of the best and worst case scenarios so that if we are there, we can prepare for it, right? So, as hard as it may seem to believe, there were people in the early 90s warning about misinformation in the internet, right? Like there were people there, right? And so and it wasn't that they're just lucky. It's just that it's actually not that hard to again sit down and simulate and think about like, okay, what's the best case, what's the worst case, and what can we learn from the past? And that's what you're getting at. And so if I were to predict where we're going, I think it's going to be very similar to what I mentioned, the credit card industry. So what I talk about in the book here is that, in the 1800s and 1900s, these kind of credit agencies were giving credit scores to people without them knowing what it was. And, you might be denied the ability to buy a house or buy a product because, all information that you didn't know about. But what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s was that because was starting to become so influential, laws were passed where, you could get your credit report. Even still, I kind of reference in the book that the credit card industry and the credit score is still opaque, There's still some unfairness that are there, but comparatively, we've developed some ways to try to hold it accountable to increase transparency. So what I see is is most likely follow that trajectory, where over time, over the decades, we're going to start to see some laws come out to help rebalance, to help workers get to more accountability and transparency. And we are already seeing that. For example, in Illinois, in New York, and I believe Maryland, the state legislatures have passed laws stating that if companies use AI systems to make hiring decisions, one, they have to disclose to the candidate that they're using AI hiring system. And they should, again, legislation takes a long time, but in some drafts of the legislation, they said that companies have to reveal the criteria the AI systems are using, right? So that would help us get towards a more equitable and more transparent, accountable future. So I see that happening. And I don't know if this is a good time to talk about. I discussed some ideas to help maybe get us there faster. Is it a good time to talk about this? Or
Yeah, talk about it
sure.
for sure.
So one of the things that I talk about is that, I often feel a little bit like, I don't know, it's dissatisfying to me, just as a person, to be like, yeah, wait for politicians to figure out, right? Like, I don't know, like that's to me, that's a very dissatisfying response because, as you know, politicians move slowly. They have a lot of competing interests. They move where the wind moves, right? So it's like, like, yeah, okay, I hope in the long term they figure it out, but I wouldn't rest, kind of my hopes on that too much. So what I kind of proposed, and one idea that I had is that one cool thing that the internet has enabled is these crowdsourced rating systems, right? Where when we have experiences with different companies or agencies, we can kind of report that in a crowdsource. And of course, the most successful crowdsource example is Wikipedia, right? When we're able to literally crowdsource a lot of the world's information. So I was thinking, looking at examples with like, for example, sustainability and in terms of like adhering to certain principles and ethics, there's all of these now rating systems that are there that for these other measures. That's when you're interested or if that's important to you, you can look it up. Yeah, like how are they using even in the 90s? I don't know if you were there, but or if you could go back and read about this, where when it was revealed that Nike was using child labor to build their shoes, right? People were upset. And they were like, hey, like we don't want to buy products that have child labor, right? And so they responded very quickly. So what I'm trying to say is consumers, we do have power. We do have power with our voices and with our wallets and with our rating systems. And let me just give one more parallel. So I don't know if you've heard of Consumer Reports. Yeah. So I see you're nodding. Many people may be familiar with them. So if you think about it, Consumer Reports started many decades ago because there was frustration with policymakers are not keeping pace with making sure that, I don't know, the toaster oven, their microwave, right, is optimal for consumers, right? So Consumer Reports, literally started to help provide a voice for consumers. If you think about it, they're not, as far as I know, funded, especially at that time, by the government or anything else like that. But they had a huge impact on the way a lot of organizations change. So my idea and my thought, and I give some examples in the book of can we create as consumers, can we create similar types of things that whatever aligns with your value. I don't know what exactly you care about or what I care about. I know what I care about, but I should say what others care about. But if you care about something, in terms of maybe it's fair pay or ensuring there's transparency and accountability, I give some examples in the book where organizations are trying to mobilize consumers and researchers to create these rating systems so that we don't necessarily have to wait for lawmakers. And maybe the last point on this, ultimately, I think we need all hands on deck, right? We need policymakers to figure out, we need consumers to be engaged, and we do need organizations themselves to be invested in trying to create more mutually beneficial outcomes. Because I don't think it's worth YouTube, Talent Finder, Upwork, Fiverr, Netflix, for them to constantly have to tweak their algorithms so that they avoid gaming, right? Like there's a lot of wasted resources going into that. So basically what Chapter 9 tries to do, and what I'm inviting listeners to do as well, is let's take a step back and figure out what future do we want and how can we collectively ensure we reach that future.
One of the major points of the book, at least in the U.S., we both live in the United States, but the U.S. is headed a lot more towards that gig economy with freelancers. And in your book, you basically And I mentioned a previous paragraph, but in another section in the book, you just said that shareholders have come to view full-time employees as costly resources that decreases an organization's profitability. And then you mentioned that even large companies championed as worker-friendly, such as Google, employ more temporary workers than full-time employees. And Google and a lot of these other big tech companies have had massive layoffs. Elon Musk has reduced Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, by 90% since when he first bought it. And I think most people would be surprised to realize that Google has more temporary workers than full-time employees. We've mentioned the iron cage, and the title of your book is called Inside the Invisible Cage. As a worker, you're going to be in one of these cages, whether it's invisible, whether it's iron, whether it's, I mean, I don't even know if it's it's not even iron nowadays. Nowadays, of course, it's silicon. It's a silicon cage, right? We're in that economic atmosphere where data is the new oil, whatever, right? But how can we best make our cage kind of palatable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, to your point, that we workers, no matter where they are, they face kind of difficulties. So one thing that I'll say is like pay close attention to organizations and the policies they make and how they're using them. As I said, it is a choice on how, whether they're mandating return to office or allowing for hybrid. So if you have choice, which I realize a lot of workers don't, so I'm just starting with maybe the most privileged workers. If you have choice, pay careful attention in who you choose to work with and work for, because there are organizations who are better at, hiring you full time, as best as possible, treating you like as a family member, although, it's a very flawed analogy in the work context. So pay attention there. For workers who aren't as privileged that are there, I would say one thing to do is make sure you document how you're being treated. You might not know what to do with it now, but document it, because information is power at the end of the day. And if there are kind of, you see sometimes when you get those like class action, notices, right? And, you're eligible for some reimbursement, but, you got to make sure you have that information. So in the short term, I think it's really important that workers document and talk to each other, right? If you're having a negative experience, if you can trust or build what is the term that we use, actually solidarity, or essentially friendship with other workers, it's really important to talk to each other so that you can figure out in your work context how you can advocate for better outcomes. And really, one of the things that I get it, the reason it's so important that these changes are made is because hopefully it's better for everyone involved, right? Like, as we said, a lot of workers, monitoring their screen is not the best way to enhance their productivity. Instead, trusting them to do the best work and rewarding them when they do that, I think is one of the better ways, especially for knowledge workers, right? So meaning like, you shouldn't care about how they get there, right? If I need to take a walk after our podcast to help simulate new ideas, that's the best course of action for me, as long as I'm producing at a certain level of productivity, right? So trying to find that fit to ensure that, the motivation is there, the policies that motivate are there, that don't cross over into kind of that big brother surveillance type.
When I was reading your book where you're talking about, this iron cage, invisible cage, I was kind of thinking like, depending on the job, but in 5 years from now, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now, we'll have more workers in the office than we do now. But I do think that you can actually have more control of the employee remote. Like you mentioned in the book, if you're remote, you're isolated.
Yeah.
You're not talking to your coworkers. Yeah. And if you are, you mentioned like you're on this platform and those DMs from those platforms are monitored. My fiance got kicked off of Airbnb for making a long-term deal with one of the, she was doing this during the pandemic.
Right,
it was really hard to find a place, and she did a long-term deal, and they both got kicked off. And of course, when you use your ID, it's, if you didn't have an ID, obviously you could just create another account, but it's not that easy. And, I read articles and it's like, oh, they want you back in the office because it's easier to control you. And it's like, oh, actually, I think it's probably easier to control you. Well, at least your book makes it seem like it's easier to control you when you're home, talking about the attorneys and having that facial recognition on you the whole time and able to monitor your keystrokes and you're isolated from your coworkers.
Right.
You mentioned about how they're using this talent finder, which is a pseudonym for Upwork. Am I able to say that?
I can't say anything officially because what I mentioned in the book is that, and we would talk about this as well, that the insights relate more broadly, right? So I don't want people focusing on, but I will leave it to the reader to make the connection if they want.
We'll just say like this platform that has freelancers, the only way they found out information was through a blog. So if they weren't even paying attention to that blog, they would never even have any information. It's not like they got notifications like, oh, hey, we changed how you're graded. We changed this, we changed that. And then even if you mentioned how people were paranoid to take customers or their clients off that platform because just like what happened, like I mentioned with my fiance about getting kicked off Airbnb.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm very worried about, like for the example that you gave, is that I don't know if she was able to get back on. Was she able to get back on the platform? No. Right? So that's the thing. It's like these unilateral decisions are made, and it's so hard to be like, hey, like, can I explain? Like, or even if something did happen, like you might not have been aware of the rule, or like, pandemic was like a crazy time, like for first time in 100 years or something, right? That like we had such a wide spreading that caused so much or was linked to so much more, whatever, right? Like there are always these other extenuating circumstances that right now it's really hard for people on these platforms to bring forward. And then once the decision is made, it's almost like excommunication sentence that's irreversible. To your point as well. So what research shows is that some form of hybrid is the best, right? Where you can get the benefits of seeing your coworkers on site, but it doesn't make sense for a lot of workers to have to go 5 days a week, 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, 8 to 6, right? There's some times when you're a project where you don't need to be monitored. You just need independently complete it and work on it. And I think to maybe the point that I want to highlight from what we said is that going to earlier when we talked about transparency and opacity is to avoid the extremes, right? Going fully remote and then putting these tracking surveillance software on the systems, no one wants that, being, I think, all the way in the office and having no ability to work from home many days a week or stretches of a project, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense, especially when companies had record profits and productivity when everyone was working from home, right? Like you cannot credibly say now for a lot of organizations that it has to be one or the other, right? And I guess one silver lining is that amongst research is that we are seeing in a lot of Western countries that the number of the population increase is slowing dramatically, right? I'm not an expert on this, but the point that I'm trying to highlight is that when there are less workers and more jobs, it allows workers to dictate the terms of the engagement a little bit more strongly. And we saw that again, we got a glimpse of that in the first year and a half, 2 years of pandemic, right? When companies were scrambling to find workers. And so maybe that's a silver lining that in the long term may help kind of balance the power between workers and organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I've had 5 or 6 different podcasts on declining fertility, so it's certainly a real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, as we mentioned in the intro, that you are an award-winning assistant professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. So you're obviously around university students, what is that, 18 to 24, maybe if they're doing their master's, whatever. What are these young kids? I guess they're not really kids, right? They're they're adults. But what are these young adults? What's advice you give them? What are their hopes and dreams? Do they think we're going to be living in a much different world than we are now? Are they afraid of AI? Are they hopeful for AI? You kind of have your pulse on this being a professor. So let's talk about this before we wrap this podcast up.
Sure. It's a great question. One thing I'll highlight is every year I ask students, how many of you, their first round in the interview is now recorded? Which again, we don't know if they're using AI or not, but a lot of them are. And every year the number of hands goes higher and higher, right? And so I am seeing these themes that I've talked about in the book where people are like, yeah, I had no idea, why I was passed up or not. And again, that was true in the past as well. I'm not for sure it was, but when you sometimes when you met somebody or you could like maybe hear or get some sort of feedback, those opportunities are decreasing. So on that aspect, it's a little bit worrying. Um, for the younger demographic, my advice in general is focus on building sustainable skills. So that means continuously learning, adapting, and being able to recognize the pros and cons. Too often we're like, oh, generative AI is the best thing ever, or it's the worst thing ever. It's like, no, you know what? It's good for some things, but it's bad for other things. Let me give you an example. So there's some early work that's showing that when people rely on generative AI for coding, for example, it's helpful in the short term, but it doesn't allow them to learn the skills that will allow them to do more complex coding or to advance in their career. You know what I'm saying? So it's like maybe the example we could give is like, oh, if a car can drive by itself, that's really useful. But when it encounters a problem, if you don't have the skills to take over, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, right? So the advice I generally give to students is to make sure you focus on those core competencies that will allow you to succeed even when things change, right? So again, if you talk to some of the older professors, right, they didn't necessarily grow up with email, but they were able to adapt to it because they could learn fast. They're comfortable with new and uncertain situations. And so going back to the other point, I can't predict what's going to happen. But what research has shown that if you are willing to learn, if you're willing to adapt, generally speaking, you will be able to change with the time, so to speak.
So today's guest is Hatim Rahman, who is an award-winning professor at Northwestern University, who just recently published a book called called Inside the Invisible Cage: How Algorithms Control Workers. So I just have two final questions for you. Just one, where can people find your book, get a hold of you if you want to provide that information? And then secondly, just leave us with a final thought.
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. I mean, the questions are amazing, and I really appreciate you engaging with the book and the material in it. So you can find the book on any retailer. So the book is published with University of California Press. So I will say if you order through them, they have a 30% off, right? So that's an incentive. It is also available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Powell bookstore. So yeah, pretty much any of your bookstores out there. And it should be available in all formats, including electronic format and sooner than later audio as well. So that's that. The last thing I want to end with is what I briefly touched upon, but I want to make sure I emphasize. That the technologies that we have and the ones that are going to come out, artificial intelligence, people are talking about quantum computing now, they fundamentally reflect our values and priorities. When I say our, I mean society, government, organization, and individuals. So what that means is that we do have a voice. We do have the ability to shape how it's going to be used. And we saw that with social media, right? We can retweet something that's uplifting, or we can we can doom scroll, right? There's what's more complicated than that, but I just wanted to emphasize that don't feel like it's hopeless out there, or that nothing can change, or nothing it's all going to head downhill. I think that individually, collectively, we can create technologies that reflect what we value and prioritize, or the best of what we value and prioritize.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.